Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this third panel in today's Conversations program. My name is Colleen Milliard. I'm at Basel's executive editor. And I'm thrilled to introduce two speakers who are brave enough to take on quite a big question: how to build a timeless collection. Importantly, fortunately for us, these two people are not just anyone, they are true experts in the field. So we have the philanthropist Dan Sallick, who can give us his point of view, and then the head of the Art Advisory Americas, Matthew Newton, who are going to exchange on this big topic, how to build a timeless collection. This panel is presented in collaboration with our friends at UBS. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dan and Matthew to the conversation stage. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for taking time to come and listen to our little conversation here. As you said, my name is Matthew Newton. I'm the head of the Art Advisory Americas for UBS. And so what does that mean? That means that we have a service available to private wealth clients where we help them think about building, taking care of, and making generational plans for exceptional lasting collections. So that's kind of the theme and what we're going to get into today. And I guess we're going to learn how to build a timeless collection, but we obviously have a certain amount of time to learn that today, so we'll see how we do with it. I'm very fortunate to be able to have this conversation today with Dan Sallick, a really wonderful collector and someone who's involved with a number of institutions. I'm going to read to you a short bio on Dan, but there's a lot of wisdom here that I'm excited to learn from Dan, and I think you all will appreciate getting a slice of that as well. So Dan Sallick is a passionate collector of modern art who served as chair of the Board of Trustees for the Smithsonian's Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden from 2016 to 2024. In 2024, he was elected to the Board of Trustees of the Guggenheim Museum. Dan is founder and managing partner of Evoke, a national strategic communications, advertising, and government relations firm in Washington, D.C. He specializes in uncovering bold ideas that capture the attention of policymakers, the media, and other key stakeholders. Earlier in his career, Dan held senior political communications roles, including press secretary to House Democratic leader Richard Gephardt and communications director for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee during the successful 1998 election cycle. So please join me in welcoming Dan today. All right, so let's dive in. Maybe, Dan, I'd be curious to hear, just to sort of set the stage for us from a historical standpoint, do you remember when you first bought an artwork? Like about what year that would have been?
I think the first artwork I bought was in 1999, and it was kind of a revelation, which is I stumbled into two prints by the artist Robert Mangold, and I didn't know much about him, and we were young, just married, and we were trying to figure out how to put our house together. And I loved these two prints. One was orange, one was green. They were together $3,000, which was a lot. And all of a sudden I started doing research, and I was like, wow, Robert Mangold, he's been in MoMA. He's in museums, and all of a sudden I've got these two pieces that are in our house. And it just was like a revelation to me that you could live with the same art that was in museums. I mean, it was like a stunning thing. And then, you start to say, okay, well, there's Robert Mangold. Well, who else is there? And I was really fortunate that there was a great gallerist in Washington named George Hemphill, who was about 6 blocks from my house. And every Saturday I would walk down, and he was a great talker. And he taught me about abstract expressionism. He taught me about great photographers like Sally Mann, and just kind of opened up the aperture towards all that and started kind of a lifelong passion.
That's fantastic. So 1999, that was actually before Art Basel Miami Beach was even founded. So I'm kind of curious. I mean, thinking about that. I mean,
yeah, we went to the first one.
You guys, okay, yeah, perfect.
And it was amazing. It was just shocking to come through the doors here the first time, and the sensory overload and the sense of discovery was just over the top.
Does it feel different today?
I still, the first minute you walk in, I still get excited to see what's there and to walk around. It's like this jolt of energy and creativity, and you're in Miami, and it's fantastic. So I still love it as much as I did the first time.
That's funny. I know that feeling exactly. I came here as an exhibitor for many years, and so you would see like the walls going up and then the artwork getting hung in the crates, and then you walk in the morning of and it's like it's all pristine, lights on, is ready to rock, you know.
The only thing that was different this time that I was disappointed in is I think for all the years until this year, you'd walk in and right to the right was one of my favorite gallerists, Karsten Grev, who always had at least one or two Cy Twombly's on the booth. And I walked in this time and he wasn't there, and I was like, "Wait, what's happening?" But it's fantastic.
So maybe, so thinking back to '99, I'm curious, just to set the stage for what things are like today for collectors. Maybe you could, for those who weren't participating in the market at that point, including myself, like what was the landscape of being an art buyer like in 1999?
I think as I got into it, I think it was, obviously it was, I would say, somewhat pre-digital. So there wasn't as much information flying around. So when you came here, you were really seeing things for the first time. And I think now you come to Art Basel, and if you're a collector, you're seeing hundreds of artworks before you ever come, whether it's on Instagram, on PDFs. And I've actually now tried to stop looking because it kind of, I got invited to see these beautiful paintings by Sam Moyer at Young Arts in Miami. And I kept seeing things on Instagram. I'm like, I don't want to open this. I don't want to look at it because I want to see it for the first time in real life. And I think back then it was about seeing things. It was, whether it was going to Chelsea in New York or whether it was coming here or traveling, you were seeing things for the first time in person before you had the digital experience. And now you almost see everything ahead of time, and then you have to readjust your perspective based on seeing it in real life, which can be, very different.
It is sort of interesting to think that our experience of art is being mediated so heavily by those images that we see, and that seems like that's a big part of how. And I'm curious how that's affected your approach. It sounds like you're trying to sort of revert backwards to an older time. That's like, okay, I don't want to be mediated first. I just want to see the artwork.
I also think for collecting too, for me, it's I never like to make fast decisions, and the internet and digital marketing and the way the art world works now, it gives you this sense. It's almost like it's become gamified, where it's like decide, and sometimes you have to just sit there and say, you know what, I'm not going to decide, and if this is really meant to be. Like there's an artwork at the fair that I absolutely love, that I've been here since Tuesday, and I've seen it 10 times. I'm like, okay, if it's here at the end of the fair, it's meant to come home with me. And it's almost like a reverse part of that game, which is, the artwork and the collector trying to find each other, as opposed to it being kind of pushed on you.
I think it's such an important point, and this comes up a lot in my conversations with our clients because there's a common perception. In some cases, in a lot of ways, it's true. Like a lot of the art that's out on the floor today has sold already earlier in the week, and a lot of people feel like, well, if I'm not there right at the beginning, I'm not going to get an opportunity to buy the best things. And from years of participating in the market, I'm like, there are thousands and thousands of artworks sitting on shelves waiting for someone to come
scarcity is not an issue in the art world. I think the art world would like you to believe scarcity is an issue, but it really isn't. And and in some cases too, maybe you'll pay a little bit more later, maybe you won't. But I think it's important to try and get comfortable with the works that you're buying so that you really want to live with them for a long time. And sometimes that doesn't come the first time you see a piece. Sometimes it comes, 5 years later. I always joke, the gallerist Sean Kelly, I'm like the bane of his existence because I bought a number of things from him over the years, but it just takes a while. I mean, he was trying to push me on Joseph Kossuth, and literally I went back and looked after I bought one of the definition pieces, and our first exchange was 7 years before about that piece. And it's like there was no profit in that sale for him.
Had the price changed in 7 years?
It was around the same, maybe a little bit more, but but I finally understood it. I didn't quite get it in the beginning. I didn't understand him, and then little by little you learn and you pick up all this information, and now I love it. And but it took a while.
So maybe setting a little bit more context, shifting gears a little bit for just to help our audience understand your personal perspective and background. Institutional support is something very, very important to you. Your relationships with the Smithsonian and now with the Guggenheim. I'd love to hear about how you think about those.
I mean, for me, the one big issue is I always tell people who are starting to collect that it's almost impossible to me to be a collector and not be involved in museums, because there's so much to learn, there's so much to give back to them, and they need so much help that I find part of the richness of being in the art world and being a collector is actually the relationships I've developed at the Hirshhorn, at the Guggenheim, also even museums I haven't been officially involved in Washington, like the National Gallery and Smithsonian American Art. I mean, to me, that's where all the texture is. And what you find is that the curators love to talk about what they're doing. The institution wants to embrace people, and they need more people to get involved. And I feel like that's job one for any collector, is figure out what museum you want to be a part of and dive in.
And it's a bit out of like self-interest, right? I mean, there's a lot of benefits to that collecting.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've learned so much, and what you also realize is the things that the curators are talking about at museums can be very different than what the gallerists are talking about in terms of what they believe is important, what they think is going to last and stand the test of time, because they're really curating for history, where the gallerists today are curating for where are we right now for Art Basel today? And those are, sometimes those things come together, sometimes they don't. But I think museums offer that longer term perspective that can be really useful.
And we were talking a little bit before coming out about the difference between historical value and financial value as it relates to artworks. And you made the point, which I've felt myself as well, that there are things you can look back on artists that are very important to art history, and the prices are very low, or vice versa. There's probably things that are very expensive. They're probably not that important to art history. How do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think it's almost pervasive in a lot of ways. I mean, I think about an artist like Robert Rauschenberg, who, he's not inexpensive, although there are works that are affordable. He's got to be one of the most important artists, maybe one of the 10 most important artists of the 20th century, and you could buy a major Rauschenberg for the price of a 35-year-old who's never had a museum show. And so it's interesting to think about. And the work is tougher in some cases, but he's so important. There's so many artists that couldn't really exist without his example. So it's almost interesting to look at those gaps in the market.
Rauschenberg is a great example. Making that point, we had a client buy a work this week here at the fair that transacted at auction in 2009, the exact same artwork, for about 20% more than it sold for here at the fair, which I think is kind of interesting. It is a historically important artist, which is kind of fascinating.
Well, and I also like to think about, I'm not afraid to. I'm a big fan of both works on paper and prints. And for example, Cy Twombly is one of the artists I absolutely love. If I could sell my kids for a Cy Twombly, I would. But since I can't, but I've lived with a Cy Twombly Roman note print that I bought for, I think, $11,000. The gallerist threw in the frame in 2000, and I think it's a fantastic example of his work. It's completely satisfying now, however, 20 some odd years later. And you can live with Twombly in that way, where the same painting of that would be $4.5, $5 million, and it wouldn't even be considered an important painting.
That's interesting. So, you mentioned a few, just to kind of round out our understanding of your sort of point of view here. You mentioned a few of the artists that are in your collection. I wonder if you could, without asking you for an inventory, but just some of the types of artists or themes that you find in your collection.
I would say we started in a very rigorous place. I think sometimes collectors put rules on themselves that ultimately you realize you shouldn't have had in the first place. So we started out in a very minimal conceptual art, 1960s, Donald Judd, Joseph Kossuth, Ancora, people like that. And then little by little, we opened it up and started getting more sort of bold in our choices. And, my wife was like, every artwork we buy is black and white. We've got to stop. So we started to experiment. We have, now we have a lot of contemporary photography, which is another interesting market point, so many things are incredibly undervalued in the contemporary photography market. Sculpture has come into the collection. So I think we're much more open now to things that just feel like interesting experiences and things to live with. And I also would say over time we've realized that the mixing of classic and historical with contemporary makes everything just that much more exciting.
But that probably takes a lot of personal confidence on you and your wife's part to trust, like, okay, we like this, and even though it doesn't fit with anything else we've bought, we trust our instincts enough to go for it.
Well, there's a great example, which is my wife fell absolutely in love with a huge Candida Hofer photograph that was the most maximal thing you can imagine. It was a pink room from a German mansion, and the photograph was, I think, 8 feet tall, and she loved it. And again, Sean Kelly's like, for God's sakes, like, make your wife happy and buy this. And we brought it into the house, and it actually just blew everything up in the best way. Things that were more, so a lot of the black and white things just kind of came to life because you had this focal point that was totally different. And I think things like that gave us a lot more confidence to try and push the envelopes. And now we have, video and neon and all kinds of stuff now that, and it's just constantly a jigsaw puzzle of trying to make it all fit together and see what talks well to each other.
All right, so shifting gears a little bit, there's been a lot of conversation around who have been the collectors driving the sort of growth of the contemporary art market over the last, call it 20 years. Most of those people tend to be in their 70s and 80s at this point. You mentioned like mentors that have helped you along your way. I'm sure you've seen that. I guess the question is, who are the next people coming along? Have you seen, maybe in some of your roles at the institutions, maybe you've seen them? Like, who are these people?
I mean, it's interesting. It's a huge question because I think the current art market today was developed by, I would say, a lot of New York, in many cases, finance-driven collectors who were incredibly passionate, incredibly dedicated, very philanthropic, who are now, probably between 70 and 85 years old or have passed away. And it is a big question, who comes next and what do they want to buy? And I think that the two big questions are really, one, who are they? And I don't think we really know right now. The art world is now much more global. I would say maybe a little less philanthropic, hard to tell right now. And then I think it's also what kind of work is going to drive their passion. And it's a little bit of a jump ball to me because at least in the organizations I'm involved with, I don't see, I was kind of the junior person in my 40s coming up with all these, Titan art collectors who had done all these amazing things. And I'm not sure I don't see the lineage as clearly as I did, when I was coming up.
So I guess, it sounds like there's an opportunity for you to be a mentor here. I mean, do you see that like opportunity development? Are there channels in place where that can happen?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think the museums are channels. I mean, we're constantly trying to pull people in. And, one of the things that I really championed when I was at the Hirshhorn was that we decided we weren't going to have a uniform price tag to join the board of the museum. Because what you found is if the price tag is too high to join a museum at the board level, then it really just limits you to, mostly people who've inherited money or people who made a lot of money in finance. If you're talking about an annual gift of, $250,000, $500,000, $1 million, like there are not that many people that can really do that in it. And I think what we try to do with the Hirshhorn is who are people who can help us? People who have skill. We had former journalists, we had people who had skills in marketing, people who knew things about how institutions, we had people who knew real estate because museums are just giant real estate projects. So we had a whole collective of people. And I think what we found is that when you did that, the people who had a lot of money were interested in meeting people who did other things, and it kind of worked as an ecosystem as opposed to it being very kind of uniform. So I would encourage a lot of museums to think that way versus just pure financial threshold, because it is about pulling networks in, not just about the raw dollars you get year over year.
I mean, it is interesting to think about it. You mentioned how a lot of the wealth that drove collections in the past was generated through financial industries, that sort of thing. And a lot of attention and a lot of conversations happen around like, okay, when the people who are generating wealth to collect art with from technology that's been happening over the last couple of decades or more at this point, when do they come online as collectors, and will they, and which kind of art do they want to buy? I'm curious. I don't know if you'd have any perspective or thoughts about that.
I mean, it's interesting. I think everybody's tried. I think the gallerists, the museums, everybody's tried to pull in people from the technology world, and I think there's like a different mindset about about ownership, about their fascination with the interior of how things work versus lifestyle. And I also think the same is true with just younger people in general who are digital natives, who have a very different, they're willing to spend $20,000 to fly halfway around the world to go see a concert or to have some kind of in-person experience, but they don't have the same feeling about, building a home, building multiple homes, owning a lot of things, which maybe is a good thing in general, but you definitely get the sense that culturally it's shifting more to experience. In some ways, I mean, I don't know how many people come to Art Basel. It's
like 80,000.
So 80,000, but are there going to be 80,000 artworks sold? A lot of people are coming for the experience of being here, which I think is fantastic. I mean, it's great for the culture. And you think about how many people go to museums versus buy art, and I think that's a good thing. But for the art market, it raises the question of who's going to pick up the slack from, from the giant collectors. You look at the Leonard Lauder collection or the Meyerhoffs, people like that, and I don't know who's going to do that next.
Yeah. Although you did, you picked it up at some point along the line. You're like, okay, I'm going to get involved.
Yeah. But at a tiny level, relative to that.
But
but that one thing I will say, and when I saw this question that you asked about a timeless collection, and there's a timeless collection in the way that Leonard Lauder did it, which maybe only a handful of people can operate at that level, where you can just truly go and try and buy the very best of what's out there. But to me, the timeless part is almost about the experience. It's about I could go through every artwork in our house and tell you where we were when we bought it, the gallerists, the people who talked to me about it. And there's something really rich to me about the stories behind every artwork versus just the acquisition. I don't think I've ever bought a piece at auction. In some ways, buying something at auction is so purely transactional that, at some point maybe I'll do it, but it doesn't feel as gratifying to me as we were somewhere and saw this thing and met these people, and now that's just a part of the timelessness of our collection is about the kind of personal history of it more than about, some, bigger thing than that.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. I've found in my experience speaking with collectors, they tend to fall into one of two camps, where they're either, just as you said, comfortable with buying from a gallery. They like the experience. They like to know that the artist is being nurtured and taken care of, and others who only want to buy from auction because they think, well, that's the real price because it happened publicly, and I can understand that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, to me, the price is like. If it's something you can afford, the price is almost secondary to, I think, the experience. I mean, you had Jose Davila, I think, yesterday, and I have two works of his. I've met him a couple times. He's a really fantastic person, and I remember the first time we were with some older collector friends of ours. We ran into them in London. It was pouring rain, and they said, "We're going to 7 galleries. Come with us." They commandeered a British taxi, and we spent the whole day. And I remember the first time I ever saw Jose's work was with them in a gallery in London. And, you kind of never forget that day. And so every time I look at those works, I think about my experiences with Jose. I think about that day in London. We ended up at Duke's having the best martini I've ever had.
Yeah, I've had one of those.
But to me, that's so much more important than will Jose be in the history books? I don't know. I don't think he knows.
Right.
But for me, there's always something really special about his work, because of that.
And that would be different if you had said bid
Yeah.
on the phone.
Yeah, just bid.
Yeah.
And also I what I find too is that I think there's a little bit of a sense that the art world is impenetrable, and I actually find that it's much more accessible than people realize.
I agree.
Even it's funny. Even sometimes you walk into a gallery and the people at the front desk are always, I think they've been taught to be stern or something, and then you realize if you actually just start a conversation, it's like, oh, they went to art school. Their dream is to do this. They love this artist. I think you can break people down in the art world and get really connected to them, but it's just kind of breaking through that initial wall and having those conversations. Same with artists, and I think if you love art, people in the art world want to talk to you, whether you have a little bit of money or a ton of money. Probably more if you have a ton of money, but
that is true. People say like, "Oh, the art world is very exclusive." I'm like, start spending money in it. It opens up pretty quickly. But
yeah. No, but even if you don't, even if you're, I'm kind of a slow buyer, and it probably annoys people, but I feel like over 25 years, I bought enough art. But people, I think if they know you care about the artists and they know you're involved in museums and you're interested over a long period of time, you can really develop lasting relationships that can make you a lot smarter about art that are also a lot of fun.
So let's shift to a different topic. I'd love to get into the idea of connoisseurship, and maybe we could start with like, what does that mean to you, and how we starts to separate that. I mean, we talked about the pulse, and like you getting like dozens and dozens and dozens of like gallery previews. It's like pop, 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 pop. The images and the whole thing. It's like, how do you slow that process down? And why does it take you maybe 3 years to make an acquisition?
I think about connoisseurship, which is, I think, a really important. I would say it's an underused word in the art world, because a lot of everyone's trying to get you to transact, and I for me, connoisseurship is about stepping back and really trying to understand art history, understand artist motivations, trying to determine, even within great artists, there's good, better, best, and really trying to understand what, at least for your internal calculus, what makes a truly fantastic artwork. And I think it takes time to learn that, and it's okay to make mistakes. I mean, we made plenty of mistakes along the way of thinking something was great, and then maybe later you don't think so much. But to me, it's about really trying to understand, what are truly great artists and truly great art, and then within that, how can you get as close as you can to being able to potentially live with it. And the one, I've gotten a lot of advice over the years from museum curators who, I would say, one of the ways to really get to those great artworks is, I think, if you're open to works on paper, prints, you can be living with truly great artworks at an affordable level that that I think it's really worth considering. I mean, if you think about Jasper Johns as a printmaker, I think his prints have as much integrity as anything he did, but it's at a tiny fraction of the price of his paintings.
Well, for a lot of artists, when they're making a print, I mean, they're as invested in that as an artwork as they are, anything else. It's just, it happens to be a different media, but it's still their work.
Yeah, and the other thing I think about in terms of connoisseurship too is, as you observe artists over time, it's trying to understand their motivations and also evaluate how they're changing. And I'm a big fan of artists who are unafraid to change what they're doing over time. And some of the best artists will have distinctive periods where they are doing very, very different things. And I think that's always a hallmark to me of a great artist, that someone is willing to move away from something that they're very successful in and maybe even commercially successful, and then try and do something completely different, is kind of the, a bold thing.
It is extremely bold. It takes a huge amount of courage on the part of those artists to do that, especially when they've found some level of success for a certain body of work. I'd love to think about how you apply that idea of connoisseurship when you don't have the lens of time yet, for an artist's career. If you're looking at young, emerging artists, like what kind of questions are you asking yourself, or what are you thinking about of like how, which artists you want to sort of pull into your collection?
I kind of look at it through two lenses. I would say lens one would be what are they pivoting off of? I mean, it's almost impossible for an artist to not be working off of some art historical lineage. So I feel like that's one thing I look at is what are they pivoting off of, and are they doing it successfully? Is one, or is there somebody who's trying to do something completely different, and is that successful? Much higher bar, but sometimes that happens, and so that's one way. And then just the visual power. It's like, is it something where you haven't seen it before, or you haven't seen it before just that way? Is I think something that is interesting. Like I'm a big fan of Sam Moyer, who and she's changed her work a lot over. I would say she's squarely a mid-career artist right now. When I first started looking at her work, 15 years ago, it was very different than it is today. It's always the investigation of painting materials, and the work she's doing now, where she's integrating slabs of marble in and around painting, it's interesting. I'm like, I haven't seen that. So I'm interested because I haven't seen that before. And I also love the fact that she's evolved into that from something else. And if, my sense is she'll probably evolve out of that before too long too, which makes her, I think, a great artist.
I guess it's hard to know if something is, you haven't seen it before, if you haven't seen much, which I think is kind of part of that process. Like, you've kind of got to get out there, like, looking at a lot of art,
Yeah. I think that's the one thing I would say is, that's why I love this art fair and art fairs in general. It gives you a great chance to just survey this massive landscape. I think museums are obviously a place where you can see what are the choices they're making, very intentional choices about what they're showing and what they're not showing. And and then I also find reading a lot is interesting too. I mean, there have been some phenomenal biographies. There's a fantastic biography of Willem de Kooning, a great biography of Cy Twombly. There's great writing about Lucian Freud. So I sometimes reading about the art world in different times just kind of fills in a lot of blanks about why things are the way they are right now.
Museums came back up. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that, and specifically like the overlapping sort of interests and perspectives of museums and the market. And I bring it up because I think there's a perception that like museums are way over here, like the art market is like way over here, but and in some cases that is true, and I think there mentally there is, but there's also like places where they interact and overlap. And I'm curious to hear, for someone who's been doing this for 25 years plus, like, what's your perspective on those ecosystems and where they connect?
I actually think there's a pretty healthy overlap. I mean, it gets a little dangerous in some areas, especially with living artists, but I think, so for example, the Hirshhorn shows a lot of younger contemporary artists, which makes the museum so much more dynamic. But in doing that, it also means they have a lot of relationships with galleries. A lot of collectors are involved with both the artists and the museum. So, it takes a lot of discipline on the part of the curators and the museum staff to keep everybody in the right lane. But when it works well, you get to see, a lot of contemporary art in a museum context. So, right now at the Hirshhorn, they're showing their 50th anniversary collection, which are some of the great artworks of the 20th century. And then they have interventions with contemporary artists. So you'll get to see an artist like Nathaniel Mary Quinn next to a Picasso, or, a whole number of these interactions where, Rick Lowe against a Cy Twombly. And in some ways, that's the great test to me, and the thing I love seeing the most. And it's kind of what you see at the art fair here too, which is how do things stack up? When you see up and coming young artists and someone who's in the art history books, and then you really get a sense of like, okay, I mean, if you walk through that Hirshhorn show, if you're in Washington, you'll see a number of these interactions where you're like, okay, these are like serious young artists who can hold their own against, some of the greats of the 20th century, and that's super exciting to see. Like, I would put Cecily Brown any day up against the Willem de Koonings there, and they show you together, and you can get to decide yourself, okay, is she playing at that level? And I think it'd be hard to say she's not when you look at the visual result.
I'm sure Cecily is excited about having that comparison, but I would think that de Kooning would have been excited.
It all looks better. I mean, there's an artist I don't know that well in that setting called Takwasi Dyson.
Yeah, sure.
And a beautiful, huge circular painting, very powerful. And they have it next to probably, one of the best Franz Klein black and white paintings. And I would say the Klein, which could look a little 1950s, looks so much more electric next to this more contemporary piece. And like, to me, that's like the essence of what gets me excited. And I think as collectors, we all try in our own little ways to create those dialogues in our own houses and lives, and not as successfully as that. But I do think that makes it really interesting.
I guess we are very high-minded, and we try to get to this idea of timeless. That is kind of what that means. The Klein is sort of, almost like reborn in a way.
Yeah,
through
it
the
is.
artist.
It totally is. And I also think the timeless thing too, to me, is like Donald Judd's a great example of timeless, where you can look at a Donald Judd from the 1980s, the 1960s, and some of them look like they could have been made in today's world with today's manufacturing techniques. And and then you realize, wait, this is a 40, 50, 60-year-old piece of art. So to me, something that can stay that fresh for that long has a lot of staying power, I think.
I like to have my own personal philosophy around artworks in terms of when they were made. I like to say, well, if I can be in the same room with it, then it's contemporaneous to me, right? And so it was made 5,000 years ago, but still we're here together, at this particular moment.
Well, the one thing we haven't talked about that I also think would be worth discussing is contemporary photography.
Yeah, please, sure.
Because I also think that's a huge opportunity in the market, because you have some of the great contemporary photographers of the 21st century, late 20th century, that are, again, a fraction of the price of younger painters. And it's been an interesting journey for photography, because when those artists like Gursky came into the fold, the entire world didn't have a camera in their pocket. But then you kind of look back. I was actually excited to walk around the fair and see, probably for the first time in 10 years, like a decent amount of large-scale contemporary photography. And I think that's, in terms of your own life and living with work, it's incredibly satisfying to live with large-scale contemporary photography on a personal level.
My wife is interested in Nan Golden too, so that's kind of on my wish list.
Yeah, and even that, I mean, those, you talk about value to historical importance. People like Nan Golden are, going to be in the history books forever, and the work is incredibly affordable relative to other things.
Yeah, exactly. All right, we were looking sort of back in history, looking a little forward. We are very much in a digital age right now. You work in communications. I'm sure it's a big part of your world as well. How does that overlap with what museums are doing? How do museums like thrive in this moment? Not just like survive it, but how do they sort of like take advantage of this period we're in?
I don't know. It's interesting. I definitely feel like artwork that deals with technology in some way is really important to show, and I feel like museums are doing a good job of leaning into that. I also feel like, when you think about the challenges facing museums and the art world, it's about, the next generation of visitors. And, at the Hirshhorn, we play around with this phrase or idea of radical accessibility. And to me, radical accessibility is a couple of things. One is it's about making everybody feel welcome. And two, it's about thinking about what's going to make younger people excited. Because unless you can get younger people coming to museums, the future starts to get really bleak in terms of financial sustainability. And so you think about what are those, maybe it's shows, maybe it's also just installations or immersive environments that can get people really excited.
I sometimes wonder too if it's like it could be the opposite. Like for my kids, it's like so much of this, and not my kid, me, I spend so much of my day doing this. It's like a place to go where actually maybe you don't have to do that, which is kind of nice.
Yeah, to me, I think it's definitely getting people away from the phone, but I think they're so curious about technology and about the world that when you see things that are really good and interesting that are either interactive or involving technology, you can see how it connects a lot of people. But then again, also, you think about an artist like Basquiat, where there are not that many Basquiats in museums, but when there's a great Basquiat in a museum and you walk by, you can see a lot of young people huddled around that versus maybe the Kandinsky.
Yeah, or maybe I like to sort of remind myself of, I think last summer when the Vermeer show happened, they gathered all these works 500 years old, and the show was sold out for months in advance. It's like, that's kind of exciting, that even art across a range of times can bring people out to it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, to me, back to the original point, I think museums have to be a part of the conversation about the art market, because I think the two are so totally intertwined in terms of the future of art that it's really important to talk about that and to encourage people to get involved.
Dan, as the clock's winding down on us, I'm wondering if just sort of last overall sort of foundational advice you have. There are people here who have thought about sort of starting to dabble in collecting. Maybe they're ready to make the plunge. I don't know. Maybe any sort of words of wisdom.
I mean, for me, it goes back to the beginning of the theme of the talk, which is timelessness, and I think to me it's all about to me, collecting art is all about the journey of it, and not being so focused on. I think people are so focused on the financial aspects of art, and we have no idea if the things we're buying are going to be worth anything a year from now, 5 years from now. I think once you divorce yourself from that idea, suspend your disbelief and say you want to live with art in your life, and you're going to figure out how to do it, whether it's at a small price or a medium, or if you have a lot of money, whatever it is. If you kind of just get focused on the experience of finding art, learning about art, figuring out how to live with it any way you can, like that's the richness of the whole thing. I mean, trying to guess if you're going to make 30% on a painting in 4 years is like insane. And I think people just need to like get away from that mindset. I know what it's all about, and we're all into kind of gamifying investments and Bitcoin and all that, but I feel like art needs to live in a different headspace from just the money conversation, because after a while it just gets kind of it doesn't lead you anywhere, because I've seen people where they buy something and then the minute it is worth less than what they paid, they hate the artwork. And it's like, wait a minute, this thing could be the most important thing you own and you won't know it for 15 years. So it's just like moving away from that and into, how does it feel when you walk by it every day as you, grab your keys and go to the car? Is like, that makes your life a lot more interesting.
Terrific. Well said, Dan. Thank you very much. Tremendous amount of wisdom here. Everyone, please help me in thanking Dan.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Matthew. Suspend our disbelief. I think this is very much a takeaway for us today, and an invitation to all of you also to continue visiting the show floor. Thank you to UBS for working with us on this project, and we'll be back at 4 for the third and final installment of our digital dialogue series looking at art and technology. So come back later, and thank you for coming.